All right, welcome back to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode number 2. And if you're new, feel free to subscribe so you can get notified when I come out with new episodes. I'm going to try and do at least a couple every week to discuss some of the work of Syd Barrett. And that will include things like his paintings as well. That's what I hope at any rate. So it's a little bit difficult dealing with copyrights on images and whatnot, but as much as I can figure it out, I'll try and put things together. I think what I want to try to do from now on is I'm going to just up front give a heads up on the songs to be reviewed. That way I can kind of tell you what to go check out, and I'll link them in the description if you want. But if you don't have the ability to go check out the links in the description, you can go check out the songs and then come back and watch the episode. And as a general rule, just keep in mind the things that I want to talk about for the songs are sometimes guitar parts, and that won't be so much now because the early stuff Syd wasn't really doing a whole lot of guitar work on. I want to discuss things like themes in the lyrics and some wordplay and some other kind of sounds. If we can, let's try and hear things that will develop over time into the sound, the Pink Floyd sound, I guess you would say. So the two songs that I want to discuss in this episode are called Lucy Leave and Butterfly. And these were not released as singles, and they weren't on the Piper at the Gates of Dawn album. They were released in 2015, which is very interesting. It is interesting to me that particularly Lucy Leave is a pretty good sounding song, and it wasn't released for a long time. I mean, 2015, it's just odd to me that this song would be held back that long. So anyway, go check them out and check back in. This is about 2.5 minutes in, so you'll be able to get back in and then pick up where we left off. Okay, so hopefully you've checked out Lucy Leave and Butterfly. The link that I connected in the description for Lucy Leave has a bunch of different pictures of Roger Syd Barrett. So if you want to see pictures, then you can use that. And I'll put together some thoughts on some of the songs. The first one I want to discuss is Lucy Leave. And one of the things that hits me anyway right away is the quality of Syd's voice, as you can tell, compared to the last episode that we did. This song, his voice has kind of a snarl to it, and a little bit of almost like a John Lennon snarl in it. And this song actually kind of has a Beatles feel to it, to me, and it sounds pretty good. As for the theme, the lyrics are pretty simple. And how it was put together or why, I really don't know. But there's two things that I kind of want to point out as themes. One is he has kind of a dismissive tone to his voice, and this is kind of a bittersweet love kind of a song, but he's using almost like dismissive, misogynistic terms for this Lucy person, calling her a little girl and telling her just that she's got to leave. But then, a line later or so, he's like, she's got his heart, and, he doesn't want her, he's in love with her and everything else. So it's kind of a torn attraction song, and I think most folks have experienced something like that, but that theme of kind of dismissive misogyny, I think you'll find return in some of his later songs, so I'm just going to make a note of that. Now, one more thing is, as we go through, I'm going to compile these in a list for his themes, and when they repeat, I'm going to put a number next to them. So for now, it's the first time this is kind of coming up, so we're just going to make a note of it. Now, for the other song, Butterfly. Oh, one more thing about Lucy Leave, and maybe you didn't notice this, but it's very interesting to me. There's a lot of talk about the odd rhythm that Syd has, and some people love it and some people hate it. But as he's kind of screaming Lucy leave and then picking back up again with lyrics, you can note, if you pay attention, that they're not all on beat. They're a little bit off beat. Who knows if he's doing it on purpose or not? Some people think he just has really bad timing. For me personally, I believe it's on purpose, and I like it. It's kind of like a jazz, offbeat, half-beat catch, and it's a variation in rhythm that I find very attractive. So just wanted to point that out. Now for the second song, Butterfly, which to me is kind of there's not a whole lot to this song. There's really only one reason why I wanted to include Butterfly, and that is that there is a form of almost like a discordant harmony going on. Again, somewhat like jazz, that seems like it's off by half a note in a key. And they're harmonizing, but it's not really matching the key that they're playing in at all times. Again, somewhat attractive, but also has a kind of a spooky feel to it. And over time, if you know Pink Floyd, especially with Mr. Barrett, that sound develops and it becomes more pronounced. So I just want to point that out in this song Butterfly, that I'm hearing it, and I had never heard that song before tonight. I was just going through and looking for other early songs to kind of run through and talk about, and that's the first time I've heard that song, and that's the first kind of thought that I had was, oh, that's interesting. That sounds similar to the discordant, and I'm not a music expert, okay, so I don't fully understand the nature of chromatic signatures and stuff like that. I don't get all that, but I do recognize that they're not all in the same key. So those are the two works of music that I wanted to kind of talk through from Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd's repertoire. And I'd like to move on then to a contextual element of that era. And for today, what I've selected is one of my favorite female artists from that era, and a lot of folks like her, but I don't think a lot of particularly Americans will recognize her as Françoise Hardy. And she's kind of, I don't know how to say this, she's almost like the female artist of that era. And if you check out her music a little bit, I think you'll kind of see why. Now, there are other artists from that era that were popular in France, like Serge Gainsbourg, but for me, she's the most interesting. Some folks like Sylvie Vartan, I don't know. I can't find someone with the quality of a voice like Françoise Hardy has. And I'm going to include some of her songs in the link so you can check her out if you're not familiar with her. Now, the reason I want to include her as it relates to this topic is because she recently made a book, authored a book titled The Despair of Monkeys and Other Trifles. And this was copyrighted in 2018 by Farrell House in Port Townsend, Washington. Now, I believe that's the English translation. And she runs through a number of her experiences, and I have to say that mentally and temperamentally, I see a lot of similarities, let's say, to Mr. Barrett. Now, I know she's a woman and Mr. Barrett's a man, but I don't necessarily see the same differences being tied to that as I did when I was younger. Now, I've met enough people that I recognize there are some pretty profound similarities just based on personality and mentality. And you can find that across the spectrum of race, culture, sex, everything amongst people. And to me, there are things that she's stating in this book that are interesting and that they could apply. Again, Syd Barrett didn't write a book. We don't have any of his, let's say, his impressions of himself or his discussions too much, other than some interviews that he did, and hopefully we'll talk about those later. But she goes through some points in her life, and I'd like to discuss those really quick. One of the things that she discusses is difficulty in her family life, and she came from a broken family. And I should point out that so did Mr. John Fogerty from the previous episode. Now, Mr. Fogerty's parents were divorced, and Miss Hardy's parents were never married. I believe that they were never married. That's right. They were never married. And her mother also was gone for long periods of time. And so, although Françoise Hardy was raised with the extended family in a rural kind of a situation, she grew up with a lot of fears and shyness. And the shyness that she comes back to repeatedly, especially in her early years, is pronounced. She talks about not feeling overly normal, and because of that sensation of not feeling normal, she would often withdraw from other people and from social situations. Now, her sister was diagnosed with schizophrenia at some point and suffered with that for a long time. That also is interesting to me. If you know the history of David Bowie, and I'm going to talk about him in a minute as well, his brother also had a schizophrenic breakdown. And of course, some people say that Syd Barrett suffered a schizophrenic breakdown. It's just kind of interesting to me that these folks are kind of showing similarities in creativity and schizophrenia. And there's other YouTube videos that talk about the link between schizophrenia and creativity, and I'm sure there's been a lot of studies on that, and I think I may have even read one at some point in time. I don't know that I've seen anything really conclusive on it, and again, I'm not a psychologist. I'm just recognizing the similarities in these stories, and it's interesting to me. She talks a little bit about the early influences in her life and how much she loved some of the English music, like obviously the Beatles, but also she liked Elvis. And interestingly also, she discusses that she had a lack of confidence in her voice, which is funny to me because I think she has an amazing voice. And again, like Syd, it's not a really acrobatic voice. It is a voice of subtle nuance, and it is smooth. And for that reason, I really like her voice. The final thing that she kind of talks about is the poisonous environment of show business and how it tends to cut you off from normalcy, and how people, even your own family, will start to treat you differently. They'll start kind of, being overly nice to you and letting you get away with things because you're this famous person, and of course you have money and everything. And she talks about how she came up through poverty, and eventually, she's making money and she's pretty well known, and of course people are gonna be treating you more nicely than they would treat an average person. And I think part of the problem is that if you're an intelligent and reflective enough person, you feel that happening and you know that it's doing something to you. It's allowing you to get away with more, and it's allowing you to change to someone that perhaps you don't necessarily really want to be. Now, she is a reflective person, and she does discuss a little bit of astrology, which is interesting to me. I'm not overly judgy about something like that. I think that it can be a tool, the same as any other tool to help you develop, and she seems to be fairly taken with it. She knows obviously quite a bit more about it than I do. One more thing. She also mentions her meetings with various people that include Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, all these people. She was very well known. And there's an interview with David Bowie that I'm going to include. And in that, he kind of talks about her a little bit, I believe. She also worked with John Paul Jones on some music, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, and she kind of talks about that. So it is interesting to me that you have these connections between all these people, at least on the surface, so that they do kind of know each other. Who knows? Maybe they're just going out and kind of having dinner and talking, and it's a show and everything. But it is interesting to me how these folks tried to at least make the effort to get to know one another. And that's pretty much it. As for the book itself, again, I read it pretty quickly. I'm going to say I read it in about 2 or 3 days. And the most interesting thing in it to me is her mentality. I have to admit that she comes across to me as someone that is very honest and internal. And I think she kind of managed to preserve a part of herself that is innocent and pure. And I really think that's a very valuable thing for everyone to try to do. And her story ends up, although she's a little bit gone through, tough times with her family and everything, I think she ends up with having a pretty happy story all in all. So I think that it was an enjoyable read, and it was a positive book. It's originally written in French, and it's translated, so it's a little bit jumpy sometimes in language. But I actually kind of like that, because there's a quirkiness to the language that is more interesting to me than just reading the same, I don't know how to explain it, but the same formulated English message all the time. So I kind of enjoyed the fact that sometimes there was a little bit of a rough structure to the ideas and the words, but I think it translated pretty well. So the other person that I kind of mentioned that I wanted to talk about was David Bowie, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to link an interview that he did about the song Life on Mars, and how he was working with a publishing company in France at the time to kind of rework French songs into English songs, basically. Now, the extent to which they rework them and everything, I don't really know. But I think he said it was called Even a Fool Can Fall in Love or something like that. And they didn't really like his version of it. And then a bit later, he recalls hearing Frank Sinatra sing the song, and it was My Way. And it was upsetting enough to him that he went and reworked it again and came up with Life on Mars, which is one of my all-time favorite songs. And David Bowie's he's probably my favorite all-time singer, artist, which begs the question, why am I doing this about Syd Barrett? And the reason is because I think there's enough material out there on David Bowie that people would say, oh yeah, he did all these things and we understand why and how, but there's not really a whole lot about Syd Barrett. And just to point this out now, if you go check out his Wikipedia page, you will see no paintings at all by him. They'll mention that he painted, but his entire career as a painter was almost the entirety of his life, and it isn't known. It isn't discussed, to my knowledge, and it's kind of interesting that I think he's been completely overlooked as an artist, as a whole artist, in all these different formats, where other people like David Bowie obviously are respected very much for their musical talents and fashion talents and all these other things. But there's so much that is hidden about Syd that that's the reason that I wanted to put this together. Now, there is one last thing that I kind of wanted to discuss, and that is we kind of discussed the nature of the borrowing of French to English music and English to French music. There is a song called Des ronds dans l'eau that was performed by Miss Françoise Hardy on Ma jeunesse, fout, her album there, and it strikes me all the time that sounds a lot like Frankie Valli's song, Can't Take My Eyes Off of You. And I'll link it, and you can kind of check it out, but it has this descending key progression that it just constantly reminds me of that song. Who knows? They both came out the same year, 67, but it's funny to me how similar they sound in my head. You can check them out and see what you think. So I guess the last thing that I wanted to discuss is along these lines, which is something I found out about. And I was watching some show, and this guy was talking about a Van Gogh painting, which is from Gustave Dore. So I went and I have the books, and the painting by Gustave Dore is Newgate Exercise Yard. And this book, London, by Gustave Dore, was copyrighted in 1872. Now, that's a black and white etching or a sketch, and Van Gogh, at some point in time, he went and put together his own kind of a version about it, and he called it Prisoners Exercising, and it's almost exactly the same, except it's an oil painting in color, and arguably that's him in the center, and it was in 1890. Now, you can tell, there's not much discrepancy in time there. And I just want to ask this question. It's something that's a little bit disconcerting to me, because you had this explosion of interesting music in this time frame of the 1960s. And would it even happen now if you had issues with copyright and people were really watching what everyone else was making and kind of suing other people, suing one another, saying this song's too much like my song, or it's not? If Sinatra sued David Bowie, would we not have life on Mars? I don't know. But I do know that if you look at that Van Gogh and you compare it to Gustave Dore's painting, that time frame is not even 20 years. And is that a transformative effect on that painting? You can argue it, I guess, but I'm just pointing out that you have, in my opinion, the greatest painter of all time that is using as inspiration another artist's work and basically adding to it. But you have to ask at this point in time, if you were doing that in the modern era, could you even do that anymore? And if not, do we have a problem? Because, imagine a world where not only you don't have that painting anymore, but you have artists that are afraid to deal with one another's work because they could be sued or called unartistic, a poser, I guess, because they're not really following what copyright law and corporations really want them to do. Anyway, it's just a thought. My next episode is going to be adult rated because I'm going to be discussing Arnold Layne. This one obviously is just some pretty harmless material, so it's not going to be rated at that level, but the next one is going to be, and that'll be the topic that I want to cover next. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode and it was worthwhile and gave you some things to think about. See you later.